We need a little like music starting. Hello, everybody. Welcome in. Happy Thursday. We're excited to have you here. We got Casey here too. As you're coming in, we have a fun little poll to break the ice. Feel free to tell us what the best season is. Hot takes are allowed. If you say winter, you're kicked out. I'm just kidding. And while you're also joining, feel free to tell us where you're calling in from. Grab a drink, grab some coffee. We'll be starting in just about a minute or two. I'm calling in from semi-warm Boston. We've had some 70-degree weather lately, which has been beautiful. Casey, where are you calling in from?
I'm in New York, and we have a beautiful, unseasonably warm day. It's like 72 right now.
Gotta enjoy it while we can, right?
For sure.
It's going away soon. Fall is winning. Fall does bring many wonderful things, but I feel like I'm a fair weather fan. If it's winter, I love summer. If it's summer, I want winter. So my responses are constantly changing. Awesome. We got some New Yorkers in the chat. Keep letting us know where you're calling in from, and we will get started in about a minute. Casey, what do you think is the best season in your opinion?
I am. I tried to vote here. I don't think I can from the back. I think I'm a spring, but I'm also a fall. So I'm a Gemini. So I usually like two sides of everything.
There you go. I do like those transition seasons into the warmer and colder seasons. All right. Well, feel free to keep sharing your thoughts on the chat, everyone. We're going to get started. We've got a jam-packed discussion, and time goes fast. So wanted to welcome you all in. For those that are new to our Rally AMA series, welcome. For those that aren't, welcome back. We like to keep these discussions very casual, more just a chat between two people. I know cameras are off for all of you, but please be sharing your thoughts in the chat. We, of course, have questions we want to go through together, but that being said, we highly, highly value your questions. So we'll do our best to answer questions as they come through and questions that were submitted ahead of time, but definitely leave your questions that you really want Casey to answer throughout the hour, and we'll answer them as best we can. Quick introduction to me. My name is Lauren Gibson. I run content marketing at Rally. A little bit about Rally. We're building a research ops platform that helps organizations talk to their users and better manage participant management and recruitment. You're welcome to check it out on your own time. But the more exciting thing is we have Casey here. So Casey, I'd love to have you introduce yourself, share a little about yourself, and then we'll head on from there.
Sweet. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited, and thanks, Lauren, for putting together this amazing discussion guide. So we definitely have tons here that I'm excited to get into. So about me, I am a manager on what we call the product practices team within IBM software. So essentially, you could think of it as something like product operations or design operations or research operations. It's part of a larger organization that we call Product Excellence. And that encompasses everything from design system to accessibility to how do we all work together. And then where I am focused is really on the systems building side of things. So what are actually the internal platforms that we're building to scale and really integrate these practices into the everyday of teams?
Amazing. And when you first joined IBM, was your role pretty similar to how it is now, or what's that kind of evolution been like for you?
Yeah, it's been definitely an evolution. When I started, we were officially called a research ops team. So that was about 3 years ago. And some of my background was in operations, in addition to UX. So I've really moved around all different areas of what you could think of as research ops, whether that's sort of tool selection and procurement and working with vendors. From the beginning, our team at IBM was really ahead of its time, I think, in starting a research repository. So that was already live by the time I got there. And that's been a continuous thread and kind of an increasing area of focus for me. And yeah, we really have spanned the gamut of those research ops pillars or areas. But increasingly, I've been focusing more on what are the internal kind of platforms and systems that we build to scale and operationalize practices. And we have just an incredible team of people that really do all of these aspects, from the operational side of things, more also to the change management and service design. And yeah, so it's really, it all works together.
Yeah, amazing. I know we talked a little bit about this, you and I, but I find org structure and organizational design very interesting, and it differs so greatly. So I'd love to quickly hear kind of where research sits within IBM, where research ops sits, where you specifically sit. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. I'm sitting on the 8th floor.
In your room.
And it's interesting with IBM. There's kind of a famous story about design at IBM more broadly, which is that 10 or maybe about 15 years ago, IBM had something like, and I'm probably going to get the number wrong, but there was something like one designer for every 70 or even like 100 engineers. So IBM had very little design in its software and product organization. And there was a leader that was brought in around that time that was given the remit of essentially establishing design at IBM as we know it today. So there was a huge effort. It was in a lot of the sort of business journals that IBM at one point, I think around 2013, went out and said, we are going to hire 3,000 designers over the next couple of years. And IBM really has established a massive and a really incredible design function. It really surprised me when I joined how just incredible the design culture is internal to IBM. And there are also parts of that are external. So we have a lot of, we have a really robust design system called Carbon, which is actually open source. So there are non-IBM companies that use the Carbon design system. We also have a huge accessibility initiative, which is part of our design org. And we, so basically within IBM, research sits within design. There's always a question of, should research be a peer to design? Is it just another type of designer? IBM has swung back and forth even in my time here. And I think ultimately the bigger question is, are teams able to collaborate, right? And so I get a little bit like bored sometimes of the question of, should we be peers or should we be in here? I'd say the better question is, are you set up to collaborate?
Sure. Quick question then. What do you think is like the most important thing to be set up to ensure collaboration is great? Or there's many things, but do you think there's one thing people could leave today and say like, okay, no matter where I sit in my org, this one thing will help kind of build that collaboration?
Totally. Yeah. So there's a really cool story that our VP of Product Excellence told, which is that when IBM started, this was a couple years thinking about its current transformation initiative around these new product practices. This was the big question, right? Can we get teams collaborating in a new and in a different way? What does that look like? And I love what she said, which is that before design came into the conversation and drew a picture of the, the collaboration, no one could conceive of how that would work. right? So the role of design and research is to also just make that possibility tangible for people and show. So we have a diagram that we call our product development life cycle. And it shows kind of at every stage of product development, how do each of the cross-functional partners contribute? Because you might think of collaboration in a kind of linear handoff way. So, you know, the PM's defining the requirements, and then it goes to research, you know, and then there needs to be some design, and then we can develop. Then product marketing comes in. But in the PDLC diagram that we've got, every one of those roles has something that they contribute at every stage. So it really shows cross-functional involvement from end to end, which I think is really powerful.
Totally. I really want to jump into the topic that we teased for this AMA about integrating research into product development. I feel like we're all talking about that. That's like impact. That's how you know research is, you know, going the distance. What would you say are some effective ways for research ops to make research insights both actionable and also relevant for product teams, and make sure that product is even seeing these research insights?
Totally. Yeah, this is probably like my favorite question because like I mentioned, when I joined, or I should say my team that I joined, they'd already done the work of creating what you could really call a research register. So before that first step of even saying, you know, who's working on what and what's going on in this org, there's really just a black box, right? I would say the first step is to understand what work is even happening in the org. Because we had that, we've been able to go a level deeper to really think about what are the insights that come out of studies, and how can we track those through to the product development lifecycle. So it is really as simple as saying, can we get our insights onto product roadmaps? And what we've started to see is that teams were doing this. Some of the most effective researchers were sitting down with PMs and making a slide that basically said, here are my insights. Here are your, you know, product management epics. How are they connected and what's the status? And what my team has really been focusing on is taking that emergent, super effective practice and saying, can we automate this so that it's not this grueling process of cross-checking each other's systems, but that you kind of can just push your insights and then move on and keep thinking about what the next target is. Meanwhile, the systems are bringing the progress back to you proactively. Because I would say that's probably the biggest challenge, is that in a product development organization, and especially a large enterprise, things move slowly, right? And it can take quarters for an insight to actually make an impact. The goal is to get that shorter. But given the timelines of product development, you really need to be able to trace impact across time. And I see that as where a lot of teams are kind of giving up and saying, research takes too much time to show up, so we can't measure it.
Totally. Yeah, I feel like I hear that as well. Of it's hard to keep track of those threads of like, oh, this is from a study that was months ago. Like that's a lot to try to follow. So you said you and your team are trying to find ways to kind of automate that. What have you found to be successful to kind of track that slower life cycle of that insight?
Yeah, I think this is something where I get really excited about automation. And, you know, I know there's a big discussion around automation more broadly on and kind of the impact on research. But for me, where automation really shines is kind of in these pain points, right? And in areas where people are frustrated in their jobs because they should be doing something more valuable with their time, right? So like chasing someone down, having a status sync update meeting, these are really the best targets for automation. And these kind of small, boring, repetitive things. So that's really where we've focused.
Sure. So we talked a little about insights. I'm also wondering how or what advice you have for really like embedding research into the product development process. So not even just did this insight land, but like how do you get research there at the beginning? Because I feel like that's a key part of making sure research is acted upon.
Totally. I think there's a couple parts to this. One is just the practices piece, right? So at the end of the day, like a tool is not the best starting point. It can feel like that today because there are such great tools and tools can make everything easy, but I feel like you always have to start with the practice. And so if the question is how do we get research into product development, it's going to need to be a shared practice between the people that own product planning and the people that own research. So one of the practices that, or some of the practices that we've developed, one is this idea of a discovery backlog. So this is parallel to a delivery backlog. And this is where PMs and researchers are really collaborating and looking at a backlog of items that a product team would like to know more about and build their confidence in, and figuring out where can research help make a decision here. Is this something that it turns out we need to prioritize? Or is this opportunity something that we actually don't want to pursue? That can be a really good outcome of research, realizing we're actually going to waste time if we do this. So I would say one practice is around shared opportunity assessment. Another is what we call internally an insights debrief. So that means that instead of just saving up the results of research for a big presentation, there's these smaller checkpoints where there can actually be a little bit of collaborative authorship and assessment of what insights coming out of a study are kind of rising to the top in terms of priority. And even before a report is ready, we've started to set up our system so that insights are going into product planning immediately after that debrief, even if the study is not concluded.
That's awesome. We have a quick question here. So when it comes to integrating research, embedding it, obviously that comes with stakeholder management, relationships. Clara has a question. First, she says, cool to see you here. How do you solve a problem for resistant stakeholders?
Yeah, I love this question. And hey, Clara, this is where I think of the hardest part of what we do as change management. And I would say, this can, you can look at resistance at many different kind of altitudes, right? And there's many different levers here. So I would say the first thing that I would say is to be curious, right? And I would say who is resisting, this collaboration and why? What's important to them that, we might need to know more about. So I think starting with curiosity is helpful in terms of getting out of this framing of, us versus them. It's really like, what are our shared goals? And then the second part I would say is just around doing some stakeholder mapping, right, at different levels, and to say, do we have buy-in at the top level for what we're trying to do? Do we have kind of a groundswell of people that also want to see it happen, that are the ones doing the work? And if not, maybe, adjusting accordingly. But for sure, I think a lot of this is really like, I call it like the social life of an insight or research. Like it's not happening in the tool, it's happening between people, and it's all about relationships.
Totally. Thanks for that question, Clara. Hopefully we answered it. And I know you said you had some thoughts, so definitely share them in the chat and we'd love to take a look. We started talking about automation, and you kind of were mentioning like choosing the things to automate are sometimes easy, the things that are repeating or taking a lot of time. But I'm curious if there's any other specific aspects of research or research operations that you find are most suitable for automation, or maybe even things that surprised you that can be automated.
Yeah, so it's a big area of focus for us and IBM, which is really in this race of developing generative AI, trying to get it rolled out, and even internally trying to use our own products, which are really for enterprises trying to be more productive. I think beyond this obvious target of like, what's the most boring, repetitive, frustrating stuff where computers should just be talking to each other. When it comes to things like synthesis or summarization, the best metaphor, and I think it comes from Simon Willison, who's sort of like an programmer and researcher, but he calls AI and generative AI essentially a text calculator. And I think that's a good way to think about how to approach automation when it comes to research content. Because we're looking into things like summarization or question and answer. So how can a product manager go into our Insights Hub and ask questions and then actually create documents, and how can we, speed up that process? But I think it's important to keep that text calculator framing in mind, because the technology is not understanding, it's going to get things wrong. That doesn't mean it can't be helpful, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunities. And yeah, we're definitely exploring that now. I like your part of your question too around like, is there something that should be left manual? And I would say it really is that piece about relationships. So even when it comes to a technology like a scheduling link, there's been some interesting pushback where some people say, I feel like it's really rude when you don't even want to find a time to meet with me. You just want me to click your link. And I think those are really important clues, right, around relationships. So I would say relationships are always going to be between people.
Totally. Yeah, I love that aspect of operations, like that people aspect, and research too, but like the relationships are important, and that's how you build impact and evangelize research, is through these strong relationships where you can, develop empathy for researchers and for the user. So I think that's a really important intangible part of the role of research. Amazing. Are there any examples of really successful automation from your experience and background that just really unlocked more for you and your team?
Yeah, I would say it's what we're working on now is it's what I got the most excited about, which is that there's a cost to doing any kind of impact tracking or accounting, and you can end up spending most of your time kind of bean counting, right? So what I'm excited about is how can we have the best of both worlds, where given that we're part of a large company, so large, hundreds of thousands of people, that you can't understand the organization just through anecdotes. You need to be looking at data and sort of rolling things up. Can we produce that data without spending all of our time on this impact accounting? That's where I think the initiative that we're working on to really tie insights to roadmaps and then use milestones in the status of product roadmaps to tell us about the impact of research automatically. I think that's going to save, in our most recent calculation, like hundreds of hours per year. And at the same time, give us better data to make decisions, right? Because we're not going to be thinking about research in terms of people tell me they like when research is involved and people tell me it's helpful. We'll actually be able to see that information and also expose it to others. So even when you're looking across insights, you can imagine not just saying, I want to know, what are the top pain points in this product area? But you could say which research has really resulted in the biggest changes to products and driven increases in usage and revenue. So that's kind of where we're pointing towards.
Amazing. We had a question submitted ahead of time from Megan that kind of speaks to both these topics, but what tools do you use for process automations and what metrics do you utilize to measure that impact? And you can also speak to the processes around some of those metrics you're tracking.
Yeah, I love this question. I think in terms of tools, I would say, especially if you're working in a large company, if you're in a highly regulated industry, some of which IBM is part of, the tools that you have available to you aren't always up to you, right? So there's one question out there, which is what's the best tool for the job? What's the coolest, newest thing? If you work in a large company, you can't just pick and choose always. So you've kind of got to start by understanding what's available to you. I would say generically, the most impactful thing for our team has really been what's called low code or no code tools. So that means that can you take business users like researchers, like operations, and those are people that have a job that they need to get done. They're not developers, they're not designers, they're not systems architects, but can you give them enough of an environment that they can start to, from their firsthand experience of the pain points, build things that make their life a little bit easier. So I'm really excited in the long term about low code as something that I think is kind of transformative, and really saying it's not going to be that we have a tool that builds that we have a team that builds tools for you, but that you've got what you need to build these integrations and automations. Yeah, and that's a big question too around metrics. I think there's a bigger question around research metrics, but when it comes to building tools and automating, for me, the biggest bucket is really productivity. So can we save people time? And we've sometimes measured satisfaction. And I do think at the end of the day, do people like it, right? Because I think we all have tools and processes and templates at work that are just frustrating. So I think anyone that's developing automations, it's always a good, quick test to say, like, does this help someone in their day? Does it make them a little happier? Or is it adding this extra, step for them?
Totally. Got to figure out if it sparks joy, right?
Totally.
Yeah. That is an interesting part of tooling. And I think a very interesting part of the ReOps role is thinking through that. Not just, is this tool good for the team, but how do I make the team's experience with this tool seamless, easy? And it's like you were saying, that change management.
Totally. There's an example that I think Kate Towsey has brought up many, maybe she wrote it once and I've brought it up many times, but she has said research operations, it's first service design. So you really need to think about the journey of even of an internal user or a product team. the touch points where they're collaborating, the artifacts that they're using. And only once you understand that as a service, is it a good idea to get into the delivery? So how do you automate it? How do you scale it? And I really believe in not skipping that step. And I'm really, it's really great in this organization to be part of a team that did that original rollout at IBM of design, and more broadly, design thinking, because it took a lot of service designers to go into a company like IBM, 300,000 people, no designers, and say, by the end of this transformation, we want our accountants doing design thinking workshops in Mural. We want, executives using this stuff. So I really think service design is an underrated discipline.
Sure, yeah. How do you, because not everyone has a background in service design or anything. For people in the audience that are intrigued by this, how do you recommend they try to implement service design aspects into their work, or be thinking from that mindset?
Yeah, and I don't necessarily have a background in it either. A previous leader of my team, who's great, had took the initiative really to say, this entire team at that time, research operations, we're going to do an online self-paced service design training together. So that was called Service Design for the Real World. It's like 6 or 7 hours, and it really gives you those fundamentals. But you can find lots of books and resources out there. I'm actually going to be volunteering at the upcoming Rosenfeld Media Conference, Advancing Service Design, just because I'm excited to learn more about that field too. So that would be another great entry point for anyone looking to get into service design.
Amazing. Back a little, and I know there's a lot of great resources being shared too in the chat. But when it comes to like tooling and these systems, do you have any guiding principles for kind of finding the right tool, and specifically like balancing flexibility and standardization, and just any thoughts for helping folks find the right tool and kind of evaluate one?
Yeah, so I have given myself this acronym just to make it easy to remember, which is like PIES. And that is portable, integrated, extensible, and sustainable. And this is there's so many other factors in choosing tools. And I'm already sort of brought it up, so I don't want to harp on it. But at the end of the day, it isn't necessarily just picking the best tool, right? You have to work with constraints. So at the end of the day, I think ops people are in a challenging place, because you might have regulatory requirements on, specific data storage needs. You might have budget requirements on a great tool that's out of your ballpark of cost. You might have an initiative company-wide, which we have, to drive our SaaS spend down and use fewer vendors. So that can really make things complicated. When you do have, at this point, what feels like the luxury of evaluating a tool, I would say important things to keep in mind are, from the data perspective, portability. So this means, can you get your data in and out? Let's say you're moving from some other system. Are you going to have to leave everything behind, And then in the event that you need to switch, can you easily get backups? You would really be surprised how this isn't a default feature for many platforms. Integrations, can you plug into these kind of integration platforms in the tool itself or third-party tools? Extensibility, this is where I get the most excited. This really means, can you build on top of the tool? So rather than saying, we're all in on this platform, we've got to get everyone to come into it, can we use that tool for what it's best at, if that's surveys or if it's qualitative analysis, and then can we bring that elsewhere or connect it elsewhere? So extensibility, I think, is really so important and also really underrated. And then finally, sustainability. I think this is like one of the reasons that I started to write about the tooling landscape in research, is that there's a lot of complex financial dynamics in the space. There's essentially tons of investment in UX research and product team tools, which means that startups are, coming out of the woodwork to meet these needs. And not every startup is successful. So you might find that you onboard your entire team to a tool, and then the next year it's shutting down. Or two tools are being merged because one acquired the other. So these can be really challenging situations. And I think looking at the sustainability and kind of the long-term outlook of the company that's providing the tool is really important beyond the feature rubric.
Totally. No, and I love pies. I think that that's great. Any acronym that's a food, I feel like we'll stick with you, right? Yeah. Amazing. Well, cool. I want to touch on knowledge management a little bit. I know it's a very hot topic. I mean, I feel like so many topics of ReOps are hot topics, at least for me. So I'd love to kind of know the biggest challenges you've encountered with knowledge management, and kind of, how you tackled those challenges.
Yeah. I would say, like we already touched on change management. When you ask people to start logging their studies, you're adding a step to their work. And you might hear people say, like, I don't have time for that, or I don't see the value. You're also asking other people to come to this place and say, when you're doing discovery, don't forget to check out the research. They might say, why would I do that? Or like, I don't get what I need when I go there, right? So there's a lot of change management, and really even researching the researchers, researching the PMs, and finding out what do they need out of knowledge management. In a company at IBM scale, I would say the problem we're grappling with now is about information overload, and how can we take advantage of how much research is generated in our super productive research organization. Because if you just go to the front page of our Insights Hub, it's like super overwhelming. There's thousands of studies, tons of insights, and we're thinking about reuse a lot. So we all share this incredible design system. When a researcher encounters a usability issue, it's likely that it has to do with the design system, and it's likely that fixing it is going to impact hundreds of products. So these are the kinds of like second order impacts that I get really excited about beyond the direct, like, you asked me to do some research, I did it, I brought you the result. The bigger question is, can people that have nothing to do with the research learn something from it and actually put it to good use?
Totally. I love the point you brought up about lots of companies have tons of insights just sitting. And so how do you make those easy to find? How do you reactivate those? Or just I think a lot of times that can just be data and evidence for making decisions as well. Looking back through that. So what tips do you have for retroactively going back and organizing? Because that sounds like a big task, not just setting up a good knowledge management system, but working backward.
Totally. I think it's always a question, how far back to go. It doesn't seem like the best use of time always to say, do we want to update, everything from starting today or this past quarter, 5 years ago. I really, really believe in the power of reuse and kind of the, I really like how Jake Burkhart is framing this. He has a forthcoming book, which is called Stop Wasting Research. And I think that if you decide to just chuck out all the old stuff, you're really wasting research. In terms of, how to decide on scope, what we've found is that when we have needed to make changes, breaking it down to the level of the responsible individual, yes, it can seem like, oh, we've got thousands of studies to update at our scale. But for any given researcher, they may have, 5 to 10 that are in scope. And I guess the other part of this would be thinking about what you really need to track and identifying what's the minimum amount of information that you can track that will help meet the needs of your product teams. So just because you can add a field doesn't mean you should. I would really question what are the most important things and how will somebody be using that information to make a decision or find something.
I think that's great advice to think from that mindset of how will they use this, how to make this information as easy for them to like digest and act on. Because I think a lot of information can scare people. We have a great question in here from Emily. It seems like knowledge management is an overlooked need for research teams. Why do you think that is so back of mind?
Yeah, and hi, Emily. If you're the Emily I think you are. In a past talk, I said hi to the Jake that turned out to not be the same Jake. Hi to all Emilys. This is an interesting one, and I think it has to do with short-sighted leadership, basically, right? Because the obvious way for research to make an impact is that role play that we just did, where you ask me for something, I give you the insight, you put it in the roadmap. That's very clean, it's very tangible, relative to this idea that someone someday may benefit from some collective knowledge tidying. And I really like the way that Matt Dweignan, I think is how it's pronounced, of Microsoft describes it, which is that he has kind of a quadrant, like a 2x2 chart. And one of basically it's, how impactful is something and how good do I feel about sharing it? And if you think about in the long term, 10 people that you've never met could reuse your insight. That's super impactful. It also continues to ripple and create impacts potentially, but those people are not part of your team. So they may never thank you. You may never meet them. You might not even be at the company anymore. This is what he calls the quadrant of doom, because it's just not rewarding to help people, unspecified future people, right? So I'm kind of always thinking about that quadrant of doom when it comes to knowledge management, and really just trying to check that bias for this short-term thinking. Yes, we want to benefit our immediate objective and KPI and team, but really just trying to socialize and build belief in the practice of reuse and these long-term benefits. And in terms of it being back of mind, I think that's an area where having leadership buy-in, and at IBM, we have many people at the executive level that are thinking at a very high level about reuse. So I think that's how our team has been given the remit and kind of the runway to work on these problems.
Amazing. Yeah, Graham just pointed out, again, or in the chat brings us back to that relationship aspect. It does all kind of come back to that. Speaking of relationship building, advocacy, in your experience, what have been some good strategies and successful strategies for advocating for the value of research and research operations and having these processes and systems and automations?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting, at least on the side of research ops, because I think there's a lot of organizations that might not have ops, are thinking about how to grow that function. I think that none of these important areas can really flourish without admitting that this is a job, right? And it's not really going to thrive if it's the side project of the most organized, impassioned researcher. So I would say the first step is really just figuring out in your organization what's the case for building out a team. And in our case, that's meant changing what we call ourselves and sometimes changing what we do and what we're focused on. So, for example, we're called product practices now, not research ops. And that's because in our org, there's sometimes a bias for thinking that ops is something more like overhead, right? So it's already like sort of a disadvantage to even use that. So I'd say thinking about that question really in terms of your organization is going to be the way. I don't think there's a one size fits all answer.
Sure. No, that makes total sense. How long ago did the team kind of move away from research ops to product practices? Has that been a while? What was that transition kind of like?
I would say it's been unfolding over a couple of years, and partly because of that changing attitude around like, we should be builders, not operators. But it's always like a pendulum swing. So I see again the need emerging and the appetite emerging for very effective ops. But yeah, we kind of at some point became very focused both on access to users, everything kind of in the recruiting pillar, as well as insights. So that was really the focus for a while. And then I'm really excited about the most recent transition for us to become part of this product practices org, because I identify really strongly with, research ops as a discipline. I like researchers like most of all. And I just really feel like I have a home in that world. But the real area that I feel like we can have the most impact is to get out of that silo and think cross-functionally. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit intimidating, but that scope of not just how do we make researchers the best researchers, but how do we make product teams the best product teams? I think research is a huge part of that. And I think it's a really good change.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think obviously the impact research ops has on research and researchers is huge, but that impact does not need to be pigeonholed in research. There's so much more. And I love in some of these other AMAs we've done, there's been great conversations in the chat of just how ReOps is in a prime spot to be a leader and example for so many different things, for customer relationships, for ethical research, like name the topic, and ReOps can be kind of that guiding leader in the space for all of the org, not just researchers, which I think is super cool. So I love that you're kind of feeling that at IBM, and I love what you said too about that is daunting to kind of expand your scope and to maybe like at least surface level move away from research ops, I guess, but it does open up the door to a lot of impact and really helping ensure research is driving the product, which it should be. The customer should be driving the product, right? More so than the company itself.
Totally. And I even think like for others that are in this kind of research ops space, it's not that nobody's thinking about research anymore, but actually that the types of work we were doing and the skills that we were bringing and the outcomes, they're totally transferable to this broader scope. So you do need someone that is thinking about research in a very narrow, you could say, and focused way. So we have an incredible team that's kind of shaped up called strategic UX research. And that's really everything about research as a discipline, from the methods to the education to the performance expectations, KPIs, systems. And they've been an incredible collaborator and partner for us because we can continue to work on building research systems, but having someone that's focused on those questions, we can take on the wider question of how does this integrate into that broader product development process beyond the one discipline.
Totally. We're getting close to 10 minutes left. There's a bunch of great submitted questions I want to tackle, but first, last quick question I want to go over is, we've talked about metrics, impact, but I'm curious if there's any other meaningful ways you measure research impact beyond just product outcomes. Because like you said, that can be a long cycle to follow. Are there any other things you're looking at in terms of cultural and strategic influence within an org?
Totally. I would say the biggest one at the level of what you could think of as the product team practices is our teams doing research, or more broadly, discovery, right? So if you're bringing in people who do research or research-like activities, talking to customers, our team's doing discovery. That's really an important thing that our wider team is focused on. And once you've got some process around discovery and some practice around it, our next big question that I think we're excited about is, can we speed up discovery? So that goes back to something that we talked about much earlier, which is that research can help you decide, we definitely need to move forward with this. We need to totally rescope this, or we're going to waste a lot of time and money if we move forward on this initiative. So I think the role that I'm excited about research playing is that at the point where a product team has identified an opportunity, can we get their confidence to a high enough state quickly that they can be making these decisions super efficiently? And I really am excited about, we have this whole way of tracking how research is landing on and integrating into roadmaps, and then what happens with those roadmaps, and then how it leads through to usage and revenue. But the one that we haven't quite figured out that I'm really excited about is that one about, can research that squashes bad ideas be, lifted up? Because I think it's one of those things that gets called like an intangible impact, and I think we might be able to tag that somehow.
Yeah, totally. I feel like I've had or heard that come up in other discussions. I think Andy Bohr maybe has talked about that, of there's a lot of power in when research leads to a no or to a decision not made. And I totally think that does seem to get buried a lot. Amazing. Graham had this question that I want to toss up. I thought it was interesting. Remembering your great fire hydrant metaphor, what non-research related domains, topics, or areas inspire you or have influenced your perspective on research ops?
This is such a fun question. I guess in this case, I was really inspired by this extended metaphor around firefighters. And it is funny because I think a lot of teams describe what they do as firefighting, right? And it's like I'm so sick of putting out fires, or I have to cancel this because we've got some fires. And so I'm also just really inspired by like this idea of the potiphore, which is like, it's a metaphor that kind of loses its original way. So you take it to an extreme. And in the case of the firefighters, I had this idea for a team that thinks of themselves as firefighters. And like, how would you structure your ops team or your research team if you were designed the way that a fire squad is designed, you know? So you'd be ready at the turn of a hat, and you'd have like a really fast car, and you'd have, you know, lots of protocols. So I feel like when these kinds of ideas emerge, it's fun for me just to follow them. I would say the other area that I get really inspired by is just systems thinking. So there's an incredible article by Donella Meadows called Leverage Points, Places to Intervene in a System. And she really is talking about environmental like climate change, basically in the 80s or 90s, and looking at different ways to intervene. Is it that, you know, we need to change certain regulation? Is it that we need everyone to take shorter showers? What she identifies as her highest leverage point ever is paradigms. So recognizing that there are mental models that are not inevitable, and you can kind of change your own mental model. So systems thinking has definitely given me the ability to carry on, I think, when things feel impossible. So definitely, yeah, it feels both random and highly tactical.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Graham. I thought that was awesome. One last question, and then we will wrap up the conversation. I know there were lots of other questions we didn't get to, but maybe Casey will be able to share some lightning answers later. But this question came in from Doug. Basically, just what are common characteristics of an environment within an organization that lead to successful strategic support systems?
I love this. And it reminded me of another sort of inspiration that's kind of out a little bit afield. But there is a designer named Dan Hill who's written a book that I refer to a lot called Dark Matter and Trojan Horses, Strategic Design Vocabulary. And I think what this question is about is dark matter, right? The characteristics of the environment of the organization. It's not like, how do I get from point A to B? But it's really, are we creating an environment that will sustain long-term success? So in this example, there's two examples. One is, you're never just designing, you know, something like a chair. It's a chair in a room, in a city, on a planet. So you need to think about the broader situation. Yeah, I would say the characteristic that leads to success, I think, is a recognition of needing to have kind of effective operations. But I think, going back to something earlier, you don't have to call it operations, but it's really a recognition at the leadership level that how we do things matters and has an impact on the bottom line.
Absolutely. I felt like that was a beautiful ending. I know we're right at the hour. Casey, this has been amazing. I feel like I could pick your brain for another several hours, but want to just end. Do you mind sharing where people can find you? Any other places for people to find your thoughts and insights?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'll drop my link in the chat. Feel free to connect. Somehow that's like the only remaining relevant social network. Yeah, feel free to connect, and I'd love to continue the conversation. And I'm going to definitely read back through this chat because there's amazing stuff in here. So thanks everyone for coming out and the great questions. And thanks, Gollan, and the Rally team.
Yeah, of course. I shared Casey's great article that I literally read like 3 years ago and thought was amazing. So definitely check that out. We'll be sharing the recording and a recap after, and potentially get Casey's quick thoughts on some of the questions we didn't get to. But thank you all for joining. Hope you all have a lovely Thursday.
Thanks, everyone.